This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything. Oh, yeah.
Welcome to episode 29 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today's March 3rd. I'm Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Last historical episode was epic yet cumbersome at the same time. We covered a lot of ground and advanced the timeline through the majority of 1833. We started out in late 1832 with talking about the printing press that was being erected in Jackson County, Missouri, also known as the Mormon Rapture Ground Zero, even today. And then, of course, we discussed some of the propaganda that was going to be coming out of that said press. We talked about the School of the Prophets, also known as the School of the Elders. A lot of new things ended up coming along once the School of the Prophets was up and running, namely the lectures on faith and the word of wisdom. The lectures on faith were just that, lectures that hashed out some of the more confusing parts of Mormon doctrine, but we'll wait until David and I get there on my Book of Mormon to dive into those. The word of wisdom is the name of the revelation given to Joe concerning the dietary restraints of Mormons. We really spent quite a bit of time on it, trying to deconstruct everything in the Word of Wisdom just to see how it reflects against current believing Mormons' diet today. Big surprise, there was very little correlation between what Mormons practice today and what the Revelation actually says. In the last episode, I also made a personal decree. The book in the current Mormon canon that's titled The Doctrine and Covenants is a complete misnomer. The doctrine part, which is the lectures on faith, has been removed from the current day Doctrine and Covenants, which forces me to call it the Book of Covenants. Just for clarification, the Book of Commandments was the book of compiled revelations that was printed in 1833. Then they added the lectures on faith along with some new revelations, and that turned into the Doctrine and Covenants, which was printed in 1835. There have been a bunch of revisions to those revelations, and then in 1921, they removed the lectures on faith, which was the doctrine part of the Doctrine and Covenants. This means that the current day Doctrine and Covenants is merely the Book of Covenants, because they took the doctrine part out of it. In the future, if you hear me refer to the Book of Covenants, I'm not referring to the 1833 Book of Commandments. I know those are similar and it's confusing there, but I'm referring to the current post-1921 Doctrine and Covenants. Meaning we officially decreed Mormon Holy Canon to have a name-o nickname, just like our favorite characters in the timeline. We also discussed the first vision account given by Joseph. It was originally recounted in 1832 and unpublished, and seemed to be done in reaction to a schism that was happening in the church, which seemed to follow a bit of a pattern with Joe. In this case, it was with Sidney Rigdon. Seems like there are a lot of times in Mormon history that power begins to slip away from Joe, and he has to do something in reaction to hopefully retain the power that he already had. In July of 1832, Sidney Rigdon, or as we know him, Hingepin Rigdon, had told everybody that Joe lost the keys to the kingdom, yet he had retained the keys, obviously trying to strip away power from Joe. In reaction to this, Joe dictated and wrote this 1832 First Vision account with the help of Frederick G. Williams, or as we know him, Freddie Willie. There was a massive number of disparities between the story in 1832 as opposed to the current version that's taught today, which was published a decade later. The final thing we talked about on the last episode was the battle for Zion. Tensions had been building up between the Mormons and the people living in Jackson County. The people had tried to evict the Mormons by first trying to chase them out, then by getting a restraining order against the Mormons. And after all of that failed, they destroyed the printing press that was run by William Wines Phelps, or as we know him, Double Dub Phelps, thus restricting the Mormons' ability to print their own propaganda and heavily limiting the number of Book of Commandments that were in circulation, because they had just started printing before it was destroyed. So after the Missourians destroyed this Mormons printing press in Jackson County, the tensions really mounted and it all came to a head. Over a few-day period, there were a few scuffles, mobbings, tarring and featherings, and finally straight-up lashings and full-on gunfights. In reviewing the history of this battle, the account of John Goebbels Whitmer was drastically lacking, affording only a small paragraph to the battle. To get a much better first-hand account, we dabbled once again into the autobiography of Philo Dibble, or as we know him, Dibble Dabble, to really give us the gory details that we were wanting, including a dude getting his jaw shot off. Keep Dibble Dabble in mind, because he's a pretty influential and active member in our Mormon timeline, and his autobiography is really quite magnificent. If you haven't checked it out yet, I would strongly recommend looking at his autobiography and giving it a once-over, because it's just amazing, and I can't do it justice here. So that closed out the historical portion of that last episode, and closes out the roundup for today. So let's get into the meat of this episode. Let's talk about Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, or as we know him, Dr. Phil. He officially entered our timeline last episode. We've discussed him before in episode 14 and 15, but when he actually entered into the timeline, that was the last historical episode here. He was sent on a mission to preach the Book of Mormon, and upon his return from that mission, he was promptly excommunicated from the church. This happened in June of 1833, and Dr. Phil's connections to the church don't conclude until mid-1834. So that is our timeline and point of focus on today's episode. Dr. Phil and his life from early 1833 to mid-1834. So we've discussed Dr. Phil a little bit in the past, but it is worth rehashing his influence on the church just to get a proper understanding of the state of affairs when he began his crusade against the church. For the majority of this episode, and for the sake of argument and ease, I'm going to grant the Spalding authorship theory. Whether or not the Book of Mormon was taken from the writings of Solomon Spalding by Sidney Rigdon, it doesn't have much effect on what we're talking about today, because it's going to be much easier on this episode to presume that it was true, just for the sake of argument. So if you think the Spalding theory is all hogwash, I don't know if this episode will be terribly applicable to your own study of Mormon history, but that doesn't mean it isn't fun to work with and study and create hypotheticals around. Also, the rise of the Spalding theory with the help of Dr. Phil was a very intense PR shitstorm that Joe and the church had to deal with, and we love to talk about controversial things in Mormon history on this show. In order to discuss Dr. Phil today, I'm going to bring on a guest. He's the mastermind as well as primary contributing writer, editor, and producer of some of the best shows in all of podcasting. You may know him from The Scathing Atheist, The Skeptocrat, or even God-Awful Movies, or you may have heard him on one of the dozens of other shows he's appeared on. If you haven't heard about him, you're truly missing out, because Noah Lugeons is a genuinely funny guy with a venomous tongue and an unlimited font of ire for religion and God in general. I feel like he and his crew contribute a lot to the atheist and secular movement, and for that I thank him dearly. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Noah.
Why, thank you, sir. And I am flattered beyond belief that you brought me in for the episode where you're going to talk about a guy named, I'm sorry, give me the name again?
Dr. Philastus Hurlbut.
Philastus Hurlbut. That is the greatest name in history. When you said, or as we know him, I'm like, wait a minute, Philastus Hurlbut needs a nickname?
It's better than that, because he wasn't a doctor. His name was Doctor.
Oh, you're kidding me.
No. His real name is Dr. Philastus Hurlbut.
Wow.
Yeah, right?
Oh, I love this guy so much.
He's
definitely my favorite Dr. Phil.
Yes, much better than the one everybody else knows about.
Right.
So for our introduction here, long before Dr. Phil even knew about the Mormon Church, there had been newspaper articles that were linking Rigdon and the Book of Mormon together, supposing him as the author, or just positing some sort of connection there. So we have to keep that in mind. Dr. Phil didn't just manufacture the Spalding theory out of his head. It was a rumor that was slowly gaining traction in the area during the time that he joined the church, when he was on his mission. Long before that, it was all something that was being circulated quite frequently. So we're just going to kind of cover his timeline here. Like I said, from early 1833, that's when he went on his mission in February. Then there's an entire reconstructed timeline on olivercowdery.com, and I'll leave a link to it in the show notes, where you can really see just the play-by-play, day-to-day activities of Dr. Philastus Hurlbut. Here we can really see his influence and where he spent the majority of his time. So in February of 1833, that's when he joined the church. Very soon after that, he was sent on a mission to go to a bunch of areas, preach the gospel, show people the Book of Mormon, give them copies, sell them copies, whatever. Sell them copies.
Okay, so
I should say that.
Now I want to just make sure that everybody knows what page I'm coming from. I haven't caught up entirely with the show. So let me make sure if I'm remembering this guy correctly. Is he the guy, and if I'm jumping ahead, I apologize. Is he the guy that was in the audience preaching about the Book of Mormon when somebody stood up and said, "Hey, I know that book"? Was that Dr. Phil?
Yes. Okay, so that was 2 separate occasions. So what happened there, that was in Conneaut, Ohio. Okay. And that's the not the hometown, but that's the town where the guy Solomon Spaulding was writing this manuscript found, that it's theorized the Book of Mormon came from, right?
Okay.
So in 1832, Orson Pratt and Samuel Smith went up there on a mission, and they preached from the Book of Mormon, and a guy named Nehemiah King stood up, he was a judge of the, justice of the peace. He stood up in the crowd and said, "You're preaching from Solomon's writings," or he said, "Old come to pass has come to life again."
Right, okay.
Right, yeah. So Dr. Phil, he was the guy that went on the subsequent missionary trip up there with Orson Pratt as his companion.
Okay.
So Orson Pratt was the guy that was there the first time the town said something about it, and he was also there when Dr. Phil was there, and they were, proselyting in both of these circumstances. So, about a year later. So,
Gotcha. Just trying to make sure I was on the right page of who we were talking about, where we were in the timeline.
That's him. Yeah. So
awesome.
We're working off of a little bit of a foundation of knowledge here that's built up in the past episodes, and that's kind of one reason why it's nice to have you here is you can ask questions that I don't normally have fielded to me on the fly, so we can add context and whatnot and really understand what's going on. In June of 1833, Dr. Phil came back from his mission with Orson Hyde as his companion, and then he was excommunicated twice for unchristian-like conduct with women.
I like him even more.
Right. And a lot of people say, well, he was kind of a bad guy. He was kind of a ruffian. Well, people are basing that off of the fact that he was kicked out of 4 churches before that for similar charges. So,
yeah, I mean, if you go by the 1833 standard, though, of unchristian conduct with women, like,
what?
I have no trust or love for anybody who wasn't kicked out of a church or 2 for that. So,
well, yeah, and most sodomy laws have been shut down by this point, and they weren't really a thing, or some places were adopting sodomy laws at the time too. So, maybe that had something to do with it. I don't know. It seemed like they were trying to charge anybody they could with being a vagabond or a disorderly person or whatever. Yeah, and I think that's kind of. Yeah, it kind of speaks to this character, who Dr. Phil really was. So after he was excommunicated the first time on June 3rd of 1833, he was refellowshipped on the 21st of June. I'm not sure the details of that, so that seems really, really weird. But he was then re-excommunicated 3 days after that. So he went in a 6-month time frame from preaching the gospel to unchristian-like conduct with women, excommunicated, back to being part of the church, and then back to excommunicated again.
Okay, so now, again, just to make sure I'm clear on the timeline here, was this after he knew about the Spaulding authorship? This was after that. Oh, okay.
Okay. So this was the beginning of it, really. This was after he had gone to Conneaut and preached, and he had a few people that said, "Hey, that sounds like old Spaulding's writings."
So it's very easy to think that when he was excommunicated, he might have had a little something on the church that he said, maybe you wouldn't let me back in. Nobody ever hears about this kind of a thing. I mean, obviously, that's purely hypothetical.
That's purely hypothetical, but we're going to talk about something that lends credibility to that might being the case. Okay. So what happened, he was excommunicated the second time after 3 days of rejoinment or whatever. That's when he started going on a tirade, basically. A huge campaign to discredit the church, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon, and show that this Spaulding text is where the Book of Mormon actually came from.
Right, but I guess if you want to be truly fair to him, you have to say that also kind of gives the church an ability to say, well, obviously he had ulterior motives. He'd been kicked out of other churches. He was a ruffian. He was a vagabond. Whatever. He was, ran around with loose women, etc. So yeah, okay, all right.
And
so
that's why this theory is often maligned in a lot of historical studies, is because he was considered just a vitriolic anti-Mormon, and oftentimes when it's studied by Mormon scholars or Mormon historians that are believers, they see somebody like this that goes on a crusade against a church like this, and they're like, oh, well, he's just an anti, right? No matter what he reported, what he talked about, who he talked to, it's all just made up. It's all lies.
Yeah, and I can see how an honest scholar would go that way with it, because there is obviously a motivation there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
But then you start looking at the evidences, and it starts to be a little bit more than you can just ignore. So that's something about it that's even regarding the character of the guy, when you look at the evidence that he got, the quotes that he got, it's really hard to just write off everything.
Especially, right. It would be an ad hominem anyway. Who cares who brought it to light if there's evidence behind it?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, and when you look to the work that he went to as well, he wasn't a guy that just disappeared into his basement for a few, weeks or months and then just came up with a whole bunch of quotes and affidavits and whatnot. No, he actually went to these places. He actually went to all of these places and interviewed all of these people. And then those interviews, the quotes that the people gave in showing the connections between the Book of Mormon and Spalding's manuscript, none of them were ever recanted or taken back by any of the people. Very, very few corrections were ever issued by the people, but they were interviewed subsequently after Mormonism Unveiled came out, which was the expose that showed the Spalding theory. After that book came out, there were subsequent interviews where people went to these same people and said, hey, is what you said to Philastus Hurlbut true? And they're like, yes, absolutely. Everything that I said, it was true. So you have a compounding of witness evidence brought to light by this guy that is considered an anti-Mormon, but the evidence is only substantiating claims that were being made in newspaper articles and were being made otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. He wasn't the genesis of it anyway, so I guess his character really shouldn't be factored in much at all.
Exactly. But that's a big problem with Mormon studies and why the Spalding theory is so controversial and why people want to ignore it so much, because he was an asshole. Simple as that. So after he was excommunicated, of course, he started lecturing against Mormonism, raising awareness of the Spalding authorship theory. After that, he went and started collecting some witness statements and lectures, using them as evidence for the Spalding theory. So just to clarify, he was going on these lectures in the Kirtland area and surrounding areas where the church was thriving. It was the headquarters of the church in Kirtland, Ohio. Conneaut's about 40 miles east of it, really close to the border of Pennsylvania. Okay. So they were separated by a bit of geography from the people that were, could have been involved with this, but altogether, word could travel fast between 40 miles.
Right.
And
even back in the 1800s.
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, we know that, books and publications only took a few months to get across the Atlantic Ocean, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when somebody would write a book in Europe, their copies of it would be here in, 6 months' time or whatever. So word traveling 40 miles about stuff like this, yes.
It'd be harder to believe that it didn't than it did. Yeah.
Exactly. And then you look at the number of people that were leaving the church once Mormonism Unveiled was published, and it really lends credibility that it was a big rumor. There was a lot of shit going on.
I gotta say, and I don't want to send this off in a tangent or whatever, but every time I listen to your show, I walk away with the feeling of, how the ever-loving fuck did they make it this far? With all this stuff going against them, how in the world did they make it to 2016 as a thing that's not just like a weird historical artifact in American history? It's like, yeah, you guys remember the Mormons?
The fucking Mormons, they're crazy.
Unbelievable.
But I mean, if you're looking at a lot of the religious leaders of this time, Seventh-day Adventists still are a thing.
Right. And Scientologists are still a thing.
Exactly. So I mean, the why. Maybe it's an improper question, because I don't think there is an answer to the why, but there definitely is an anomaly there worth pointing out.
Well, but you know what, again, and I know you've said this before on your show, but if we had the same kind of records for Christianity, we would be seeing the same thing. The Christians are still around?
Are you
kidding me?
2,000 1,000 years later?
Right.
What the fuck are you talking about?
I met Jesus. Trust me, dude. You don't want to worship that crazy bastard. Always covered in nard cream and.
Yep. Smearing spit dirt in people's eyes and whatnot.
Yeah. Right. No, you're cured. No, I'm really not.
No, that burns a lot. So anyway, Hurlbut goes on this tirade, right? He continues lecturing while he was gathering all of these witness statements. He would go to any churches or anything in an area. He would just go to a new area that his research was leading him to, and he would say, hey, I have a whole bunch of evidence that, I'm a bunch of witness statements that I'm collecting that, show these connections. And he was trying to blow it up. He was trying to be the guy on the forefront. And that's something very important because he's kind of relegated to Mormon history as this crazy anti-Mormon wackaloon. And Eber D. Howe, who ends up buying the work from him, gets the credit for all this work.
Oh, gotcha.
So Hurlbut is kind of, and we'll discuss why very soon. Near the end of this, we'll talk about why Eber D. Howe ended up getting the credit for everything, all this Spalding theory stuff.
I'm guessing, until you tell me otherwise, I'm going to guess it's because no one can take a person named Dr. Philastus Hurlbut seriously at all. That was just not even going to be a possible thing.
I will just preface it by saying, I'll foreshadow it by saying Joe took him seriously. So,
oh shit,
yeah, we'll get into it.
Awesome. All right, talk about a tease. Holy shit!
So he continues these lectures, and then he goes to Pittsburgh, which Pittsburgh was the location of the printing press where the Spalding manuscript was, where Sidney Rigdon probably took it from.
Right.
Sidney Rigdon was friends with Silas Ingalls and Lambden. Robert Lambden. No, this is Robert Patterson. Lambden. I can't remember Lambden.
You should have gave him a nickname.
I should have. He wasn't important enough. He was dead. Damn it.
Right.
So yeah. So these guys, Patterson and Lambden, were running the printing press, and Silas Ingalls was the printer. He was the guy that did all of the work, basically all the publishing or all the editing.
And Rigdon just hung out there all the time. Hung out at the bookstore they had there.
And he was also an apprentice tanner as well. And you have to buy leather bindings.
Yeah.
And a book company would probably go to a local tanner, which that he was probably the only game in town that was tanning hides.
Right.
So, he was, it's reasonable to expect that he was probably there. And
but still, it's still kind of a tenuous connection. But yeah, everything would suggest. And also, I guess, instinctively when I think of Pittsburgh, I think of 2016 Pittsburgh. I have to imagine it was a bit of a smaller town in the 1820s.
Well, they were talking about how the population was exploding in the 1830s of Pittsburgh, and I think it went from in 20 years, it went from 1,500 people to 7,000 people.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, it exploded, man. It exploded. These early New England towns, Right. Well, I guess that's not really New England. But anyway.
Just outside the border.
You
can't quite get away. Anything a little bit east of Pennsylvania, you can probably get away with calling New England.
It's the New England quadrant of the country. That's what I think.
There you go.
So he goes and interviews Robert Patterson, and Patterson was the owner of the printing press during the time that Manuscript Found would have been there. So it was a Patterson-Lambden printing press in 1816 when Spalding had died. The Manuscript Found was kind of his magnus opus, right? It was his ultimate work that it was going to pull him out of the depths of poverty. It was going to be this huge hit. But it was left in nearly completed form at the printing press. That's what's theorized anyway, right?
Right.
So Patterson said that he had no knowledge of Sidney Rigdon ever stealing it or anything, or no knowledge of Sidney Rigdon really. And then he came up with a statement later. He said that he remembers seeing Manuscript Found and thumbing through the first few pages of it, and he found it kind of not interesting. So he gave Silas Ingalls, who was the printer and the cashier of the store, he just gave it to him and said, "Sure, go ahead, take care of it, whatever." And that was pretty much the end of it. That was his only exposure to Manuscript Found. And he was an older gentleman at the time. He really didn't spend a whole lot of time, I would think, doing the actual printing work itself. He wasn't running the printing press. He was, working on bills, paying bills and stuff. So basically, Patterson is what Sidney Rigdon used as his alibi, basically. He's like, Patterson
anybody
owned
would
it.
know,
Patterson said, of course, Hurlbut is just a crazy guy because he went to Robert Patterson, the guy who would have known, and Robert Patterson denied having any knowledge of me and of the manuscript found, of a connection there.
Yeah, because
So,
if anybody's
you
going to know when something gets stolen out of their shop, it's going to be the boss. Now, think about that. Just think about that in your job for just a second.
Exactly.
That, like, the person who's least likely to know about what the hell's going on in most of the jobs you've ever worked at is the boss.
The boss. The owner.
Well, the owner. Yeah, even worse. Yeah,
the
exactly.
owner himself, definitely.
Yeah. So, not exactly a nail in the coffin of the Spalding theory, I would think. There.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, obviously it's in Patterson's best interest to say, no, someone didn't entrust me with their manuscript and it later got stolen by our tanner,
True, but it also needs to be said that Patterson had sold the printing press by 1823. No, sorry, 1818. He had sold it to Lambden and Ingalls, who were basically running it after that.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
And in 1823, this printing press collapsed. It went bankrupt, and they had to liquidate all of their assets. So you picture the Solomon Spalding manuscript was a book that was not published. It was in a printer's manuscript form, completed, ready to go. Spalding had died 7 years earlier, right?
Yeah, right.
And his wife had moved 400 miles away, his widow, and been remarried, I think, either at that time or soon after. Nobody was going to go send this thing 400 miles or go take this thing to her. It was just a forgotten manuscript. It was just a book that was sitting in the corner of the shop.
Well, right, and what are the odds that it would have turned out that Spalding read the damn thing to everyone he knew or could hold down for 15 minutes?
Yeah, he did.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
But if it hadn't been for that, there would have been no way anyone would ever know.
Exactly, and that's the thing that Sidney Rigdon was hoping for. And it should also be said that Lambden and Ingalls died in 1825 and 27 respectively, and in 1830 the Book of Mormon came along. So the two guys that worked closest with the Spalding manuscript had died before the Book of Mormon came out. The people that would have been most informed to show the connections between the two books,
right?
They didn't. Dead men tell no tales. So Hurlbut, after he goes to Patterson, he finds out that the Spalding manuscripts, just other writings from Spalding, are with Spalding's widow, who was Matilda Davison, that was her name, living in Boston, Massachusetts. So what they're talking about here, we'll talk about in a minute here. There's a few writings that Spalding did. One of them was called Manuscript Story, Conneaut Creek. Okay. We have that. That was found in Honolulu with a big pile of stuff that used to be at a printing press that Eber D. Howe was working with. He thought that it burned down and that manuscript story was consumed in the fire, but it wasn't. It got shipped off. So we have that manuscript story, and what it looks like is a rough draft. It talks about the Romans coming over to the New World and colonizing it. It's not written in Old English form like the Book of Mormon and manuscript stories supposedly were, but it does look like a rough draft. And what's interesting is there's a bunch of edit marks through it. It's very rough, and it ends in the middle of a battle. The end of it just cuts off in the middle of a battle. So it's like some of it got lost, or it's not the complete version, or it was just a rough draft that he picked up and couldn't finish and then put it down. And then after that, he probably started working on Manuscript Found, which was this magnus opus.
Okay, now I'm hopefully I'm presaging something here, but I'm aware that you can actually that they have computer algorithms that can look into the writing of like a specific, for example, they finally put the whole bullshit that Shakespeare didn't write his plays to bed by running these algorithms and finding out that, yes, this was all written by the same guy via the writing style, et cetera, et cetera. Are you aware of any attempt to do that with Spalding's work versus the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, there has been a lot of work doing on that. There needs to be a lot more work done on it. But actually, that's kind of what the secondary podcast is going to be. Reading those possible source texts. Spalding is one of them. But those statistical studies have been done, and there have been a massive amount of correlations found between manuscript story that we have and the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
But in order to understand those to a full extent, you just got to read the book when it comes out, because I started covering the whole Spalding theory in half a chapter, and now it's 2 full chapters.
Oh, right,
and it's off to a couple of people for peer reviewing. So it's to get the understanding of what that's about and the statistical studies and what work has been done on that. Just got away.
Well, yeah, no,
sorry.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Another great tease. But well, yeah, because you have to imagine that would be extremely difficult versus like comparing all of Shakespeare's plays, because the Book of Mormon would have been revised and would have had other source material being drawn into it and everything. So you wouldn't be getting a pure.
Well, and you things are not plagiarized directly, right? Things are taken from the environment that they come from, and they're synthesized down. So in that case, you have sister works, and you have cousin works, and you have parent works and manuscripts and books and stuff that you can find correlations between. This book is very similar to these two books that were written after it in the same geographical area or whatever, or by people that had access to this book, and you can see those connections. And a lot of work has been done with the Book of Mormon on that, and there's a few. Actually, that's what the second podcast is reading those books that came up with high levels of correlation with the Book of Mormon. The Late War of 1812 between Great Britain and the United States is one of them. The first book of Napoleon is. The Rights of Christ is. There's a whole bunch of books written in Joseph's time in the burned over district that he would have had access to that are very similar to the Book of Mormon, written with "and it came to passes," and things that are right throughout the Book of Mormon. You find them everywhere else in tons of other books, and it's like, oh, so it's not that original. All right, good to know. Yeah, or it's not an ancient history of the American people.
Well, yeah, probably not that either.
So let's see. When he found out that she was living in Boston, he tracked her down. And he went. He talked to her for a little while. He found out that Jerome Clark, who was her brother-in-law, I believe, had the chest that had all of Spalding's works with him in Hartwick, New York, where she was living before she moved to Boston. So Spalding, of course, had these other works. The Frogs of Wyndham was one I didn't talk about, but that was another one. And they were all in this hair-covered trunk. It's very specific hair-covered trunk, like a hide trunk with the hair still on it. So, yeah, and it's
interesting visual.
It is, right? I didn't know what it was either until I looked it up. I was like, I think I've seen one of those before. Weird. So yeah. Anyway, so he goes to Hartwick and he picks up a bunch of these manuscripts from Jerome Clark. He got a letter from Spalding's widow to say, let him into the house, let him into the trunk, and let him take whatever he wants. Right. So that lends credibility to the theory too that people that were involved, like Spalding's own widow, were willing to give Hurlbut access to this information, to this research. They were enabling him.
Well, if I was going to be the skeptic on that, though, I would say if somebody comes to you with this story and you're the widow and says, your husband's works have been plagiarized, whether or not that person struck you as particularly credible or whatever, I would think that your instinct would be to want to help the hell out of that person.
True.
So.
And he also had the ammunition of the Book of Mormon. He was carrying around a Book of Mormon with him and saying, look at this, read this, does this look like your husband's manuscripts? And she, Matilda Davidson, the widow, didn't leave anything behind on it, but her daughter, Spalding's daughter, did. And she said the historical portion is largely similar. I remember the names: the Nephites, the Lehites, the Lamanites, Moroni. Oh wow! I mean, very, very blatant, plain things that are very, very common in the Book of Mormon.
Level plagiarism.
Yeah, I mean, right.
Never miss an opportunity to dig into that ass.
Oh, fantastic! So he went to Hartwick and got some of these. Got some of these writings, and it's theorized that he may have picked up the original manuscript of Manuscript Found. So we have Manuscript Story, who looks like it's a rough draft of Manuscript Found. And then whenever a book was going to go to publishing, of course, you write your original manuscript, and then you write your final draft, and that final draft goes to the printer, right? So he probably would have had the original manuscript with him, and the printer's manuscript is what was at the Patterson printing press that Rigdon would have lifted, right? So it's theorized that he had one of those, and that kind of it might play into some of the events that transpire very, very soon after this. So after he goes and collects these, he goes to his lawyer, who's James A. Briggs, that was his name, and that guy said that Hurlbut had recovered the Spalding manuscript that he was looking for, and that he later brought that document to Mentor, Ohio, which Mentor and Kirtland are sister cities. That's where the two Mormon congregations were.
Okay.
So they were all part of the Mormon Caliphate up there. So after he goes, he takes the manuscripts that he found with him. He takes them to Mentor and to Kirtland. Let's see. Actually, sorry. Before that, he went to Palmyra in Manchester area. That's Joseph Smith's hometown.
Right.
On his way back into Ohio. And he collects a bunch of affidavits from people that were neighbors of Joseph Smith, of the Smith family.
Okay.
And they said, what do you think about the Smiths? He did the same thing that he did in every town, and he went to the pastors and anybody that had a public area and said, "Hey, I'm doing an expose on Mormonism. Mm-hmm. Everybody that knows Joseph Smith or everybody that wants to learn about Mormonism, come to this church at this time. I'm doing a lecture." And that's when he collected a bunch of signed statements. There was one statement that was signed by like 50 witnesses. That all signed the statement. They're saying that the Smith family are indolent, drunkards, intemperate, just horrible people, the dregs of society. The people just did not like the Smiths. So he went through there, and he also published a newspaper clipping, or actually the Wayne Sentinel, which was Wayne County, which is the newspaper of Palmyra area. Mm-hmm. They published the Mormonites article, and that detailed the Spalding theory. And the crusade that Hurlbut was on at the time. So he gets back to Kirtland on December 18th, 1833, after he's been to all of these places, done all the research, found the manuscripts of Spalding, and he's done a ton of work, right? He gets back to Kirtland on December 18th, and that's an important date because the next few things we talk about happen pretty closely sequentially up to the end of the year here. When he gets back there, he meets with the anti-Mormon committee that had hired him to do all this work. They didn't really hire him. They just said, we'll pay your expenses when you're doing all this research. So he kind of joined up with this committee, and that's also another reason why a lot of his findings are considered, anti-Mormon or whatever, because he was actually employed to do all this stuff.
Right, but I mean, if you hire a private investigator to find out if your husband's cheating on you and he tells you that the guy is, you don't say, well, you had an ulterior motive.
Right.
So, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Right.
Exactly. But, that also...
But, yeah, I guess I can see if you're already inclined to write this guy off and say this guy is just a bigot or whatever, then, yeah, that's a little bit of ammunition, although certainly nothing definitive.
Right. Or just calling him an anti-Mormon. That slaps a label on him that a lot of Mormons will understand that no matter what he says, no matter what he prints, writes, whatever, it's of no consequence whatsoever. Just ignore it.
Probably why the Mormons don't, lose any sleep over your show.
Probably right. That's true. Okay, so J.C. Dowen, who was Justice of the Peace in Mentor, said this about Hurlbut and Joe. And we, before giving this quote real quick, we need to understand there's two Justices of the Peace that we're going to be dealing with here. We got J.C. Dowen and William Holbrook. So this is J.C. Dowen, and he was in Mentor, the Justice of the Peace in Mentor, which was a very heavily Mormon influenced area, but he wasn't Mormon. He wasn't a believer.
Okay.
So Hurlbut stayed at my house every 3 or 4 days for as many months. I read all of his manuscript, including Spalding's manuscript found, and compared it with the Book of Mormon, the historical part of which is the same as Spalding's manuscript found. Which is about the size of the papyrus Joe had with his Egyptian mummies. That's something else.
That guy's such a fucking nut. I was just, I guess we could go on forever about him reading Egyptian. But, sorry if you didn't hear the air quotes, by the way, there were air quotes.
After that, this Justice Dowen says, quote, Hurlbut said he would kill Joe Smith. He meant he would kill Mormonism. The Mormons urged me to issue a writ against him. I did, as recorded in my docket, December 27th, 1833, on complaint of Joseph Smith, warrant returnable to William Holbrook at Painesville, Ohio.
I don't know if I followed that exactly.
So what happened, this J.C. Dowen guy, he was housing Hurlbut while Hurlbut was kind of transient at this time, traveling to all these places. He didn't have a home to nail him down to or whatever. So he was staying with this guy, J.C. Dowen, who was a Justice of the Peace. And Dowen said that Hurlbut handed him a manuscript and said, this is manuscript found. Look at it. This is amazing. Mm-hmm. And he read it, and he read he knew the Book of Mormon, or he knew about it, and said, this is really similar. This is really amazing. Right. Kind of weird how this is. And then, after that, Hurlbut said that he would kill Joe Smith. So the time frame he's talking about here is a month period from, half a month from December 18th when he got back into Kirtland down to December 27th. This is over a half a month period.
Okay.
It's theorized. It's part of the theory that Hurlbut had the original manuscript found. The original here that would have completely destroyed all of Mormonism. And he made a deal with Joseph Smith. He said, if, pay me for this book or whatever. Or he said something to that effect. I have ammunition, blackmail. That's all it was. It's theorized though. It could also be that he never attained a copy of it because it doesn't exist today. Whereas if he did attain a copy, you'd think that it would exist. You think that it would have gotten out. It would have been, it would have blown up or whatever.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if the Mormons had their hands on it, you certainly wouldn't think that would happen.
Definitely not. But if Hurlbut, being the kind of guy he was, it seems like he might be predisposed to taking some quick money and running, right?
Right.
So the Mormon Church did come out of this book. Oh, what's the harm if people follow a church, whatever, even if it did come from a false book or whatever?
Yeah.
If they're going to pay me $2,000, $5,000 for it, I'm just going to take the money and fuck off, right?
Well, there's also the possibility that he just used that time to write his own fake, Spalding manuscript and then try to pass that off. I mean, it's just, I know the church has a habit of buying forged documents that would be really damning to them if they were real. So, I mean, that's another possibility that we could at least throw out there.
Yeah, topical for the 80s. Yes, indeed. Very true. Almost $1 million worth of it.
Yeah.
But no, it seems like that could be the case, right?
Yeah.
And of course,
plausible.
Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon, if they found this to be an existential threat, which it was, of course, they would go to whatever lengths possible to not allow it to get out to the public, right? Because that would strip them away from everything. That would, come on. And they'd be crucified for it, right? So you would think anyway.
Well, yeah, Peter Popoff's still going. But yeah, it would certainly hurt their growth. Yeah.
It would hurt the growth, definitely. Or at least it would bring more persecution, maybe enough to snuff out the flame, instead of just the perfect amount of persecution to,
yeah, right.
to really get it going. So he issued this writ on the 27th of December, and at the same time, and that was to answer to the Justice of the Peace in Painesville, who was the William Holbrook guy we talked about earlier. There's two justices. Dowen is in the area of Kirtland and Mentor. Holbrook is in the area of Painesville.
Okay.
So Joseph asked for a writ against Hurlbut because he felt threatened at the time, answerable to Holbrook in Painesville. The reason why is because before that, when Hurlbut was traveling through Painesville a day before, he had filed a suit against Joseph saying that he felt endangered by Joseph, like he was going to assault him or something like that.
I gotcha. So it's like when my little sister would steal something from me and then immediately run to my mom and say that I stole something from her. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Same thing. Oh, he did it first.
Right.
He started it, right? Yeah, same thing. So Joe filed this complaint 2 days later, and they both got to Holbrook at about the same time, meaning that the hearings would be heard in separate trial, or in the same trial, as opposed to separate trials. Right. Okay. Which was good for Joe because then he could bring the crew. Then he could bring his own lawyer. Then he could bring witnesses. The witness, it says 50 people written in the recounting of it. It's thought maybe he brought 15 people, not 50 people. But if you also think about it, at this time, the church had over 1,000 members.
Yeah, how hard would it be for him to scrape up 50 people willing to lie for him?
Yeah, exactly. So, and, stuff the entire courtroom full of those people. So it's understandable. Altogether, it's understandable whatever way it did happen, either 15 or 50, whatever. So it ended up the guys went the rest of the year without any troubles. I assume that's just because kind of like, the world just kind of shuts down for that week from, Christmas to New Year's. I think that's kind of the same thing that happened here because Hurlbut was not arrested until January 2nd, I believe. January 4th. That's when he was arrested. So, okay. So, like I said, tensions were building. Hurlbut was arrested. The Mormons were, rising up against this anti-Mormon crusade that was happening against Hurlbut. They really didn't like him. So Joseph ended up running around with a crew, with an entourage to make sure that he was good. This is a quote from Benjamin F. Norris, who's a non-Mormon from Perry. He wrote his brother from Painesville talking about the Mormon Kirtlands. The Kirtland Mormons. He said, quote, "There is a large society of them about 2 miles from this place," talking about Mentor. "Rigdon and Smith reside here. They have established a printing press. Rigdon and Smith are the founders of Mormonism." So he's qualifying who they are, right? "It is said that the inhabitants have threatened mobbing them. They are now arming themselves with instruments of war, such as guns, swords, dirks, spontoons, etc.
Jesus.
Smith has 4 or 5 armed men to guard him every night. They say that they are not going to be drove away as they were at Missouri. They will fight for their rights."
Yeah, you heard that in Beastie Boys too, didn't you?
Right, exactly. Smith has sworn the peace against a man named Hurlbut, or Hurlbut. I'm reading this with the old, nasty, horrible grammar intact. So
oh yeah. No, I'm looking along with you on the quote here, and I'm like, man, oh my god, Missouri, really? Missouri. Wow.
Had been, not been.
Oh yeah.
Hurlbut, who had been engaged for about 3 months in
SORDS. Sorry. Yeah.
Let's see. In tracing the origin of the Book of Mormon, he has returned and was jailed yesterday. His work will be published in a few weeks, giving the true origin of the Book of Mormon. So this guy was talking about Hurlbut was arrested, and Joseph fucking anteed up with more armed guards and shit.
And then just average guy around knew enough about this to know that he was about to publish this expose.
Exactly. And obviously, if Joseph felt the need to have armed guards, the rumor was obviously strong enough that it was all a lie, that it was all bullshit, and that he was a false prophet, right?
Well, but I would think, again, just to be, just to play the devil's advocate here, I would think any upcoming religion or whatever that was preaching something different than what your church told you would be suffering from the kind of persecution, especially at that time, that would justify having armed guards around you. So it wouldn't require them to necessarily know why he was full of shit for them to decide he was full of shit just because he didn't agree with their preacher. But
true. And he had lived through experience too. I mean, he'd been dragged out of his house a couple times by this point, tarred, beaten. I mean, he didn't want to last episode we talked about the Battle of Zion, right? That was a battle in Missouri. There was actually a gunfight, a scuffle where 3 guys, 2 Missourians, 1 Mormon, and then, Philo Dibble Dabble that we call him. He was shot 3 times in the side and then ended up surviving. And it's just, like we read his firsthand account. It's horrible. Just going on that whole, it was bad. But anyway, so obviously Joe was anticipating that same thing happening in Kirtland, and that's why he had the armed guards. He didn't want to be drug out, killed, shot, whatever.
Yeah, right.
And he probably obviously feared not only Hurlbut, but the anti-Mormon committee that had hired him. Yeah. And because he had gotten their guy arrested. I don't know if this is true or not, but they might have gotten in a scuffle, and that's why they filed charges on each other.
Yeah, right.
I wouldn't be surprised. But I don't know.
That would make a lot of sense.
It would.
Knowing Joe, I mean, it's just like if you saw him in the street, you would think that's pretty high likelihood of a scuffle.
And speaking in hypotheticals alone, can't you just picture this like a movie scene, right? One guy comes in with blackmail to the shady mob boss, right? Mm-hmm. That's Joseph in this case, and he says, "I got blackmail, whatever." And Joe's like, "Yeah, I'm not gonna buy that from you, or I'm just gonna take it from you, and then my guys will throw you out of here, whatever." You could see that happening too. I mean, that's a very believable scenario, and it explains why when J.C. Dowen was housing Hurlbut before he was arrested, he said, "I read the manuscript found and it agreed with the Book of Mormon." Mm-hmm. But after that, Hurlbut didn't have manuscript found.
Right.
So, and then, in that interim time, that's when he said he wants to kill Joe or kill Mormonism.
Right.
So, you see these few things that are kind of, compounded together, and it's like, maybe there was some shady shit going on there behind closed doors that we need to know about.
Awful lot of smoke for there to be no fire. Yeah,
right, exactly. Yes. Very well said. Thank you. So let's see. On January 11th, this is kind of a big part of what's happening, because The United Firm was the agency that handled all of the money in the church, basically. Joe had set out the law of tithing. He said everybody that's a member of the church has to pay 10%. He did that this early on. That's when it happened.
Yeah, right.
Amazing. And then he set out the United Firm to control all the assets of the church. It was very, very insolvent, and it was on its way down the tubes at this time. And what he actually did, the United Firm was about $3,000 in debt to local debts, and then there were that was just local Mormons' assets that they were in debt to, and then there was a larger outstanding amount to other businesses where they had acquired property and they had given loans or notes to these people and their assets outside of the community, or liabilities outside of the community. So this United Firm was going to die. And it does very, very soon later in this year, actually. But what Joe did at this time was he called for all of their debts to be forgiven by the rich guy in town, which was Newell K. Whitney, Father Whitney, we call him.
Mm-hmm.
And he said,
a Mormon then?
Yeah, believing Mormon. The first guy that pretty much the first guy that Joe bunked with when he first moved to Kirtland. So, yeah, and he called Newell K. Whitney's wife Mother Whitney because she was like so protective and so nice and accommodating and hospitable for Joe. So, it's obvious to see he had his teeth dragged into these people pretty.
I gotta say that pisses me off so much. I'm sorry. I don't want to take this on yet another tangent, but we just recently covered a story about a Russian Orthodox church that screwed some Russian Orthodox people out of money. They sued the church for the money, and then as part of the settlement, the church agreed to offer so many prayers. Yeah. So when I see this, I see the same fucking thing. It's the idea of being a church is you're supposed to be a community, but the church is so much quicker to screw over its own members. Oh, yeah. Why don't you come and do the flooring for us? And then you haggle with them about the price, and you don't pay them what you owe them, and they are a member of the fucking church, so they don't, they're not going to drag you through the mud. They're going to accept something stupid like so many prayers instead of the money you promised to give them. Yeah, that's such a pet peeve of mine. Is like churches don't take enough advantage of the people that go to them that they're also going to then preferentially find contractors that work or that are of their faith or part of their congregation just so that they have an easier time screwing them over later.
I see. See why the introduction included this unlimited font for ire and for religion and God in general, because it's so true. You see it happening back in the 1830s.
Yeah, right.
You see it happening today. It happened long before. And it's just a recurring fucking theme.
You can see it happening in the 800s in medieval England and stuff, where people were like, "Oh, I'll come and build part of the wall for your church as to get my sins forgiven this week," or something like that. Fucking break.
So well said. Thank you. So back to the timeline here. So Joe asked for the debts to be forgiven, and they were. Mm-hmm. Newell K. Whitney paid the $3,000 out of his own personal assets to forgive it. Actually, the guy we were talking about earlier, Philo Dibble Dabble, he was a very rich guy as well, and he bought the first printing press for the church, and he financed a bunch of missions for the church, and he got a hold of a bunch of property. He was one of the primary guys that was buying up property in Jackson County, Missouri, to give it to the Mormons when they were moving over. And he was a really wealthy guy, and he was another guy that Joe just fucking sank his fangs in and just wouldn't let go.
Yeah,
until he was completely drained.
Boy, he could find those the gullible rich ones, couldn't he?
Oh yeah, and it started with Martin Harris.
Yeah, right.
And then Josiah Stowell before that. And
well, everybody whoever he ever dug holes for to find magic shit before the whole Book of Mormon thing started. Yeah, same thing. It's
like a recurring theme or something.
Yeah, right. Almost like he's a con artist.
Oh wow.
Oh, sorry. Spoiler.
So Hurlbut was actually brought to the stand 3 times from his first arrest on January 14th to January 13th. So he was brought up to the stand, and then for whatever reason it was postponed or dismissed or whatever. And then from January 13th to the 15th, there was 3 full days of testimony given. This is when Joe supposedly brought the 50 people with him. Probably packed the courthouse. Hurlbut had, the anti-Mormon committee and a couple of friends there and whatever. So you just see the tide of the judge or of the opinion of the jury kind of swaying in the Mormons' way. So eventually, the finding of the court was to hold Hurlbut for a few months. Until they could convene a proper trial, because that was just a common pleas trial, apparently. So they held a full trial on April 9th.
Okay, now this trial ostensibly is over whether or not he threatened Joe or threatened to kill Joe?
That was, the complaint was specifically, quote, that the complainant had reason to fear that Hurlbut would beat, wound, or kill him or injure his property.
Gotcha.
So they entered into a 6-month recognizance, which was basically the 1830s version of a restraining order.
Okay.
It's pretty standard practice. If somebody's assaulting you or is threatening, just go to court, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And whether or not they were really doing it, if a restraining order is not going to hurt them if they weren't going to hurt you anyway. So.
Exactly, yeah. So, that kind of ended the trial. On April 9th, Ohio versus Dr. P. Hurlbut. The case reached the Court of Common Pleas at Chardon. Judge Moses Burchard presided. Lehman Copley, who was a cousin of Daniel Copley, testified against Joseph Smith. And Hurlbut was found guilty. I assume, I didn't see the note on it at this time, but I assume that Joseph probably brought the whole brigade this time as well to this same court, or to this court hearing on April 9th, just to pack the court with people that were cheering for Joe and booing Hurlbut or, Copley or whatever. So
intimidating the judge a little bit.
Exactly. And showing how many people are actually there. If Joseph Smith is such a horrible person, then why do all these people love him so much, right? So... that was kind of the end of Dr. Philastus Hurlbut. After that, he kind of disappears into the annals of history. He married a woman that was in Kirtland, moved away from Kirtland, and ended up coming back a few years later. And that was pretty much his whole timeline there of how he joined Mormonism, built the Spalding theory, basically built all the evidence for it. Ended up getting arrested because he threatened Joseph Smith, was found guilty of it, was released on a $200 bond, which was a shitload of money back then.
Yeah, right.
And then Joseph Smith won. I think that's a recurring theme. I do want to say what ended up happening with Hurlbut's work is Eber D. Howe, who was not actually affiliated with the non-Mormon committee that hired Hurlbut. Mm-hmm. He was just the editor of the Painesville Telegraph, which Painesville is where this trial went down. Mm-hmm. The first trial in January. So Howe knew that Hurlbut was in dire straits. He had no money. The Mormon committee or anti-Mormon committee wasn't supporting him any longer. He had done all this work. He'd collected all these testimonies. He had taken manuscript story to a bunch of witnesses. He went originally, got all the witness statements, then he found the manuscripts, then he went back after this April thing happened, or after he was released in April, he went back with manuscript story, Cognac Creek, which was possibly the rough draft for manuscript found, and he showed it to a bunch of the people that he had originally gotten these affidavits from, and they read it, and they said, this is Spalding's writings, but this is not the writing that I'm talking about. This is a different writing. So that's even more substantial evidence for it. It's like these people were able to identify Spalding's writings, and they were also able to differentiate between an older manuscript and the manuscript that the Book of Mormon possibly came from.
Right.
So, I mean, that's a huge point of connection as well. So, Eber Howe knew that Hurlbut had done all this work, and he was in contact with him, and he said, here, I will buy all of your work for $50 and 400 copies of the book. And Hurlbut said, okay.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to figure after he got arrested for this shit, and it was probably legitimately, unlike Joe, probably legitimately fearing for his life over this and everything. Yeah, I can imagine just whatever you can get to get out from under this at a certain point.
Well, and you think his home was in Kirtland, Ohio at the time. He had been in, he had had short tenure in many other places, but he was living in Kirtland. And that was Mormon, that was headquarters of the Mormon Church. That's where everything was going on, there in Missouri. Those were the two main theaters of operation. And you have to wonder what day-to-day life was like for this guy. the poster anti-Mormon.
Yeah.
The guy, the womanizing, grumbling, nasty, homeless guy that you know is just an angry anti-Mormon that you want to write off like crazy. You have to wonder what it was like to be in a largely Mormon community after he had done all his work.
Right.
You wonder how people treated him or how much he was vilified in general. You know, I feel a little bit of sympathy for him because at the end it's like he got fucked so hard.
Yeah, no kidding.
I mean, Joe won. Joe won. That's the
right. Yeah, exactly.
Once again.
Yeah, because he's such like basically everything you know of the actions that he took are admirable. You know, he got involved with his church, realized they were full of shit. You know, maybe he tried to blackmail somebody, maybe he made some threats with it or whatever, but ultimately he did the right thing. He did everything he could to try to prove that, and then, no good deed goes unpunished, I guess.
Yeah, there you go. And what's even more to it, you know, there's this part of the theory where people think that he actually had that original manuscript found, and he sold it to Joe, or Joe just took it, or whatever, or, you know, that mob scene that I kind of proposed as a hypothetical could have happened. And you think about it, Hurlbut, when he was in dire straits, if he was smart, if he would have been smart, he would have compiled all of that and published a book himself. If he would have been smart, he would have published all of his own work, and he would have taken credit for it, and he would have said, I was persecuted by the Mormon Church. They tried to lock me up when they found out that I had this manuscript. If he was on a genuine mission to destroy the church, he never would have sold that shit to Eberhau. He never would have let go of it. He would have published the anti-Mormon stuff he'd done.
Or now, what about this though? I mean, I'm thinking about the cost of trying to get a book published back then and everything. And if he didn't, whether or not he legitimately earned this bad reputation, or whether that was just mudslinging shit that the Mormons had done, afterwards. I can imagine being in a position, if I'm this guy, where I'm saying like, if I can get this into the hands of a more respectable guy that the Mormons haven't already slung a shit ton of mud over, maybe at least it can still get out. Like maybe they've already tainted my character enough.
And who better to do that than Howe? Because Howe was the editor of the Painesville Telegraph. He was very well renowned. He had written tons of articles before this covering everything from current events to Mormonism. He was focusing on Mormonism a lot. Mm-hmm. And, Howe had a little bit of skin in the game too, because his wife and sister-in-law were also members of the church. Wife and niece, were also members of the church. And that's what got him spurred to investigate the church initially.
Well, and just like a newspaper publisher in general would be seen as a much more like objective and a much more respected source of the information. So there still may have been, even like not even just benign motives behind him selling all of that to Howe, but even like self-sacrificing motives.
Interesting. I never thought about it that way. But
I'm dying to make Philastus Hurlbut into my hero.
With such a great name, he's already got a superhero name.
Right.
You picture him with a cape already. But
the phallus
point that I was
back of it.
Awesome. Or phallus hat. But the point that I was kind of driving at was, somebody that was just looking to make a quick buck from all this research, from this 6 months of research.
Yeah, right.
It's understandable that he would have just given something up to Joseph Smith if there was a really, really big, cherry, or a really big carrot at the end of the stick, I should say. So it would make sense, if he did that with Howe, sold all his work to Howe, he could have sold what was the most damning piece of Mormonism to Joe. Maybe he was going to play both sides of the aisle. He was going to sell this manuscript found to Joe, and then he was going to take manuscript story and show it to these people, and then he was going to publish all the information and say, this is I don't know, hang on. This is what the church, the lengths that the church will go to try and disprove, anti-Mormon stuff. They'll actually go to the work of buying stuff like this. Much in the way that it seems like Mark Hoffman did.
Right.
Kind of, trying to play both sides of the aisle.
Certainly had his own best interests in mind as well. But
yeah, I think so too. But, who knows? That's the problem with trying to dip into these, motives of historical characters, because it's so hard to establish motive. It's so hard to see the world through the person's eyes and why they did what they did.
Well, the thing is that if you look at all the information that you presented. It's very easy to fit that in with the Spalding authorship theory, but it's also really easy to fit that in with the Mormon persecution theory. So I can see how a Mormon can look at all of the same information and say, well, yeah, but clearly X, Y, and Z. But the fact that, that we do still have, extant examples of Spalding's writings is huge. The fact, and so, I guess we owe Hurlbut a debt of gratitude for that, if nothing else.
Definitely. And I would say just for all of the work, all of the travel that he did, all of the, even in just sitting down with all of these people and writing down what they say, or preparing these statements and having the people sign them or whatever. Even just that amount of work, just to put this information out there, just to make people know about it, I think that's noble in and of itself, right? Yeah. I mean, even if he did have selfish intentions, selfish, motivations of trying to get rich off of this or something, there was still a kernel of nobility at the root of his actions, trying to liberate people from Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, from this church, from this cult that he saw that he preached for a little while, and then found out how much bullshit it was, and then decided to go on a tirade against. So, self-serving or not, it seems like there are selfless motives buried in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, you make money off of your podcast. That doesn't mean that we have to discount the reason that you do it, which is clearly not for the money. Obviously, you can.
There's a lot of.
We could all make more money doing something other than podcasts, but yeah.
No shit. But so yeah, let's. That's Hurlbut, man. That's good old Dr. Philastus Hurlbut. That's his timeline. That's his influence on the timeline of Mormon history. And like I said in the book that's coming out here, I thought I was just going to devote a little bit of time to the Spalding theory, but it's just gotten so much bigger. I've been doing so much more research on it. It's just amazing how much stuff is there, and how much when you're talking about a conspiracy theory, like when you're talking about like 9/11 conspiracies or whatever, if you watch those videos on YouTube, people are constructing these huge abstract connections between people and between motives and, things that seem so disparate that it's easy to discount them or believe them either way if you want to listen to what they say. But it still requires having a huge base of knowledge and knowing about a lot of different things and how they can all wrap into each other and how like a spider web of ideas connects to itself, right?
Yeah.
So that's how it goes with the Spalding theory. There's so many interlocking parts that we didn't talk about Spalding himself, about Sidney Rigdon, about everything. We spent this whole hour plus time just talking about Dr. Philastus Hurlbut only.
Right, yeah, just one of the many
guy.
players, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what amazes me so much about that, like with the Spalding theory specifically, is such a great example of like how Mormonism is full of shit for being full of shit. You know what I mean? Like when the more you learn about it, like you're like, oh yeah, he translated the golden plates. But there weren't golden plates. Oh, but he actually looked into a hat with a magic rock. Oh, but the magic rock was stolen. I mean, like, the more you dig into it, the more bullshit there is buried underneath, you know?
A nesting doll of bullshit.
Exactly. And
messy.
And like you look at the Book of Mormon, and you can attack it for being like, provably historically inaccurate. You can attack it for being terribly written. You can attack it for contradicting itself repeatedly. But then on top of that, like to get this crappy, contradictory, silly book full of bullshit to begin with, he also had to steal chunks of it. I mean, I know that this is just a theory that hasn't been exactly proven or whatever, but that's so like Mormonism for there to be yet another layer of bullshit underneath. So that's why I envy your job. You can keep digging until you get to China with this shit.
It's amazing. It's like you can peel away layers of this onion for decades. And it'll make you cry all day.
Yeah, right.
I mean, no matter what angle you try and study Mormonism from, even if it's just the Book of Mormon alone, you realize, how deep it really goes. I mean, like, okay, so when I was on Cognitive Dissonance, we were talking about Mark Hoffman and about some other Mormon shit, right? And after I went on like this 2.5 minute tirade, Cecil was like, big fish, or
little
big
pond. Fish, small pond.
It's just so what? So this is so inconsequential to everything in the world. But it's like, these things this pond that we're talking about here, it's so much wider and deeper, and the fish are so much bigger than you could ever imagine. There's holy fishing grounds here that we have to fish into because it's so wealthy with amazing historical shit.
Well, and that's just the thing, is that I think that people like Tom, they look at it and they see just the surface level of bullshit, right? Okay, so like what you can hear the most anodyne version of the story of the Book of Mormon being discovered from a true believing Mormon, and that it by itself is enough for you to just say, okay, that's bullshit. so for most people, there's no reason to dig any deeper in that unless you grew up around Mormonism or you grew up in the Mormon church. For most people, it's just like, okay, that's the easiest religion I've ever had to discount. But so our tendency is to just say, okay, yeah, that's definitely bullshit. Let me move on to the next one. But at the same time, like the Mormon church is still insanely powerful in this country, and it controls an insane amount of this country and has an insane hold over a huge number of people. They control they have a whole fucking state that they control, basically, and several cities outside of that state that they control. So, yeah, I mean, it's so easy for us to just, to try to just let, okay, well, there's just way too much to dig in here to really truly understand the level of full of shit that they are. I know that they're full of shit, but yeah, to really truly understand that, maybe the danger that church still represents to this country, you have to really dig all the way in. Well, actually, you have to dig all the way in. The rest of us just have to listen to your show.
And that's what's so fascinating about it, because not only... Okay, so you're talking about, like, multiple levels of how deep this bullshit really goes. But it's also something that I find so fascinating is it seems like almost everything that I focus on, every single topic that I, like, laser focus in on and try to dig to the bottom of that rabbit hole, every time I find that there's just something about it in the Mormon retelling version that's just a little tainted, just a little tiny bit different. I frequent Fair Mormon. That's the Mormon Apologetics website.
Yeah, right.
I frequent it. It's usually, I have a couple of tabs of it open at any given time because it's so interesting to see how they try and answer stuff like the Spalding theory.
Right.
And they try. Don't get me wrong, they try. They give it the old college try. They a little engine that could their hearts out on it, but they just can't do it. So I enjoy seeing the two different sides of the history, right? Mm-hmm. Seeing their recounting of it that is so marred and so diluted, I should say, from what it actually was, from what actually happened.
Diluted would be either way. I think you were good. Well, but
best of humor.
But also, and again, I don't want to take you too far off the topic, but from a meta perspective, for a guy like me that doesn't have really, I was raised nominally Mormon or whatever, but I don't have any real skin in this game. But it's so fascinating for me because you really think, most of the religions, we don't know this much about when they started. Mm-hmm. And and of course, like you said, when you look into the starting of Scientology or Seventh-day Adventism, really any religion that we can see the beginning of, it is just like this. And, so we can really, by looking at this, we can really gain a much better understanding of the cult that eventually became Christianity or the cult that eventually became Islam or whatever.
Right. Well, it's because it seems like it's a rule that holds true no matter what size. It's a rule that scales infinitely, right? Mm-hmm. It applies to these little tiny religious sects. Like Mormonism has hundreds of breakoff sects.
Right.
Hundreds of them. I mean, even like the Strangites. I mean, even the Bickertonites. There are tons and tons of breakoffs that believe in some level of Mormonism, but discount other parts of it.
Right.
And they all have followed the same kind of path, the same kind of pattern, and it scales out to Christianity or Islam in general, even further out than that. I mean, does it go out to Hinduism or to I mean,
well, no, Hinduism.
I guess Confucianism is more a philosophy than anything.
Yeah, I was going to say, and Hinduism is just sort of an amalgamation of myths and legends and what. So there's no like founder of Hinduism that you can point to. So I think you'd have to have like a religion with a founder or with or with a messianic figure or something like that for it to directly apply. But that being said, though, like if you look at, I'm sure if you start looking at Indian history and the way that Muslims were suppressed by Hindus, that you'll find the same level of bullshit, and the same amount of quasi-legal and entirely extra-legal justifications that they use to sweep this under the rug or bury this or, literally bury this guy and then sweep his ashes under the rug or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. And I think you hit on it really well. The analog to Islam is really, really strong, parallels between it and Mormonism. You even have down to the schism after the initial leader dies, right? Once Joseph Smith died,
the succession.
There's a huge, succession crisis where so many people competed. Brigham Young took the majority of Mormons out across the plains into Utah, where he set up his own caliphate.
He's even crazier than Joe.
Oh my God, dude! Joe. Joe. I see Joe as the party boy. I see Brigham as the fucking villain.
Right. Yeah, he's a volcano layer and a fucking white cat that you only see his arm and his glove or whatever. Yeah.
It's so true. I think a couple episodes, I spent half of an episode just talking about Brigham Young quotes.
Oh, right on.
You got to check that out.
Yeah,
It is amazing talking about moon men. They're Quakers on the moon. Hoping that he would love his wife enough that if he caught her cheating, he'd drive a javelin through her heart. Woo! All the apostates are getting a Bowie knife, and he is a whole other level.
Yeah.
But that's a whole something.
Yeah,
spoiler. So we can't get into. So that's it for our discussion just about Hurlbut. As we know him, he's Dr. Phil, and obviously he was a very influential and controversial character in Mormon history. And like we talked about earlier, his actions really served to draw a lot of people out of the church, and arguably his work still does pull people out of the church today through the information that's contained in Mormonism Unveiled. That was Eber Howe's book. That was the first anti-Mormon book I ever read. Oh, and that's where all of Dr. Phil's work is. And just seeing it all in one place, it's like, good fucking God, I believed in this. I believe this is true. But anyway, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to this Dr. Phil guy. Tireless efforts, endless amounts of frustration. He must have had a lot of trials and tribulations in this 6-month period of collecting all these affidavits and whatnot. And just in general, just trying to nail Joe down on fraud charges for being the fraud that he was, only to be found guilty of, intent to assault the prophet. Right. So, all in all, it seems to be a recurring theme. Joe just wins. Said that a couple times. He just wins. It happened many times before this.
It's like
it
Donald
happened
Trump.
many times after. Yeah. There's no tower too high to crumble beneath the foot of Joe. It's amazing. He just won in so many instances where somebody had him dead to rights in a legal sense or in otherwise. I mean, he had been to trial 3 times before this, and he was let off on bullshit technicalities. And then this was the first trial that he brought up against anybody else. And the only reason that he brought up the lawsuit against Dr. Phil was because Hurlbut had already filed a lawsuit against him. So, right. I mean...
So you might as well say this is the 4th court proceeding that he just wormed his way out of on a technicality.
Yep, exactly. And he still won somehow. And he had an entourage of people rolling with him all the time. And, it's just amazing to see this happen and see the real life analogs of it today. I mean, Peter Popoff is one of them. I mean, right. There's a few of them. That
Joel Osteen, Creflo Dollar.
Creflo Dollar.
It's my arch nemesis. Everybody needs an arch nemesis. Yeah, right? Exactly.
That's amazing. So, you got to admire Hurlbut's tenacity, but more than that, you got to admire Joe's tenacity because he never let up with the bullshit. He always worked the system in his favor. He always pulled it off somehow. He always was able to just pull it out and, not have to deal with the consequences. Just wait till next historical episode. That's when Joe puts together a fucking army and marches them from Kirtland to Jackson County in response to the Saints being thrown out of Jackson. He even finds a great white Lamanite skeleton during the march. So... Hold out for that. We get to hear the story about Zelph the Lamanite.
Awesome.
So that's it for our history today. Noah, thank you so very much for joining me on this. This has been an absolutely magical adventure.
I gotta say, man, I am
Hurlbut.
always happy to derail the conversation and make a lot of editing work for you. So I appreciate you inviting me on.
It's going to be a long outtakes section at the end of this episode. So listen in for that at the end of the song. So for anybody that is, been living under a rock or whatever, doesn't happen to know about your podcast or know where you're from or anything, give us the elevator speech. What do you do for a living, my friend?
I talk about religion and use all the expletives the subject deserves. You can find us on Scathing Atheist, scathingatheist.com, or on iTunes. Or you can find us bitching about politics on the Skeptocrat, or you can find us just proving what masochists we really are by watching a different Christian movie every week and breaking that down on god-awful movies with my good friend Eli Bosnick. Now I mentioned Eli and I didn't mention Heath, so now I feel like a dick. My good friend Heath Enright, who's actually doing all the work right now. We've got an episode coming out like in 12 hours or something. He's doing all the work on that, and I almost completely didn't mention him. So don't tune in for me, tune in for Heath.
There you go. And Lucinda, thank you for joining us as well.
Hey.
She's been here the whole time, y'all. She's just been like kind of chilling.
Kind of giggling and whatnot.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this is kind of a trial run for an episode like this where bring somebody on for a historical topic or something that's coming up in the timeline, like Dr. Phil. Maybe we'll have to have somebody on for talking about the Saints' march out to Zion to try and reclaim it, or Zelph the Lamanite, or any historical topic that comes up in the near future. But
never run out of layers of bullshit.
That's true.
I said that before I knew there was a giant Lamanite skeleton coming up in the next episodes.
White Lamanite skeleton.
Right.
Yeah, there you go. Even course. Better. So, I think these could be a lot of fun. Have an outsider's perspective. See, try and peel back the layers together. Kind of fun. But,
definitely it was a fun experiment, man.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on. And that's it for the historical segment of this episode. If you want to hear that interview completely uncut, you can go on to patreon.com and sign up to support the show. Anybody that does support the show gets access to that full interview uncut. There's a lot of stuff that didn't actually make it to the full episode that was left on the cutting room floor that was included on that episode on patreon.com. So if you support the show, you can check that out and, enjoy it as much as I enjoyed having the conversation. I had a couple of new patrons to thank real quickly. Looks like we had a new Nemo Adolescent Rebel. David, thank you very much for the support. It's very, very appreciated. Also had a couple new Nemo Apostates. We had Doonan and Corrine Harris. To both of you, thank you very much, Apostates. That's fantastic. I really, really appreciate the support. And amazingly enough, we had a new Nemo Demon, Colette. Thank you very, very much for helping to ensure the continuation of the podcast. It's very deeply appreciated. There's just time for a quick listener mail segment. Got in an email from Corrine Harris, and the only reason that I said her last name on the Patreon appreciation is because she sent this in. She said, "Hi Bryce, just wanted to say fucking yes, use my name on the podcast." She goes on to say, "I am an Exmo that spent 40 years in the church, served a mission, mind-melding mess of indoctrination and rule-giving." Yep, that's a good way to describe a mission. "I was one of those super over-the-top, I'm going to make it to the celestial kingdom no matter what type of Mormons." I knew plenty of them. I started out that way, but I definitely fell away long before I got to that point on a mission or anything. So happy to have found my way out with my husband and 4 kids. Congratulations. That is amazing. The torment we had to go through was horrifying, but is relieving to not have to endure anymore. Thanks so much for all you do. And Corrine, thank you very much for sending in that encouraging email. Of course, I just kind of paraphrased it, but it just is really, really nice to get emails like that. So thank you very, very much, Corrine, for sending that in. And, as well for being a Patreon, for supporting the show. It's very, very appreciated. got in an email from Mick. He said, I know this will be very dull to you, I doubt that, but I just watched the film September Dawn and would like to thank you for opening my eyes to this. Until I heard you on, I think it was Thomas Smith's podcast talking about it, I had never heard of this. In the UK, Mormons are seen as nothing much more than an annoyance. I was actually on Scathing Atheist about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which No Illusions is the host of the Scathing Atheist, so you sent this email in a timely fashion. So back in the 70s, we did very briefly cover Joseph Smith in history class at school, just enough so that we knew it was all very silly, not in the depths you go into. I'm slowly working my way through your podcast, but have not reached 1857 yet. Keep up the good work. Cheers, Mick. And Mick, I haven't reached 1857 yet either. I have no idea what happens leading up to that. So that's an adventure that all of us are going to be embarking on here as this podcast progresses through the timeline. But this episode today got us through most of 1833 and got us into early 1834. So we're kind of picking up the pace a little bit. Where instead of covering weeks worth of time, we're actually covering months or full years worth of time with a single topic like Dr. Philastus Hurlbut. So maybe 1857 isn't quite so far off, but we'll definitely have to see. But to answer your question, now I haven't seen September Dawn before. I hear that both historically and visually speaking, cinematically speaking, it's a very poor movie. I haven't seen it, but that's just what I've heard about it. And from what I understand, there needs to be a remake of it done very, very badly because it's a story that needs to be told, and it's very, very compelling. As far as you in the UK not learning about Mormonism, I think that's kind of a shame that more world religions aren't taught everywhere. I think a comparative religion course should be mandatory schooling for most grade schools or for younger kids, just so they understand that the world is full of different mythologies and theologies. But the thing with Mormonism is it's really tough to cover just a little bit of it. You skim the surface, but you're like, as soon as you start asking questions or researching it even deeper, all that you develop is more questions, and it just forces you to do a whole bunch of research on it. So, I think everybody that listens to this show is probably a victim of that same virus almost. But yeah, at least they exposed you to Joseph Smith. That's what I should say. At least you knew about him. At least they told you something about him, and you were aware that he was a thing. So I'm glad they did that. I mean, there's probably a myriad of religions that I know for a fact there's a myriad of religions that I have never been exposed to, I've never learned about, and I wish I would have in college or even in grade school or something with a comparative religions course. That'd be awesome. So yeah, all in all, thanks for sending in the email, Mick, or Mike, or something. Yeah, Mick, sure. Got in an email from Charles Wallace, and it is absolutely amazing. So his email says, someone posted a hilarious Amazon review of the Book of Mormon as if it was a role-playing game. I thought you'd appreciate it. Keep up the good work. And it is fantastic. I'm going to put the link up on the show notes because this guy wrote a very short story of the Mormon MMO RPG. It's absolutely amazing. So please check that out. As far as the Book of Mormon goes, it looks like they have 60% 5-star reviews and 34% 1-star reviews. That's kind of that's a bummer, but at least it's $0. You can get one for free delivered to you at the door by 2 salesmen in sharp-looking suits. Just to give you a little teaser, it starts out, for those who have never played before, you start by creating a new character. You can only choose between straight male or female characters, and race selection is very limited. Update, more races added beginning with patch version 1978. Of course, pointing to the blacks and the priesthood. Along with race, some stats and options might be limited depending on your last score in heaven. Total war. This might include includes starting location, initial gold amount, upgrade path, clan size, etc. Hint, males tend to have a much better upgrade path. I read through this and it is absolutely amazing. This guy is quite the fantastic writer, and then if you look at the comments below it, that's even better because people are like, this review is a work of art, brilliant. The in-game purchases are killer, but the worst part of the game is that you never find out that you've won or lost until you die, literally. Like, it's just amazing. It's a great review. So check the show notes for that, the link to that Amazon book review. And thank you, Charles, for sending in the email. Appreciate it. And that's it for this episode. Like I discussed with Noah, next episode promises to be quite a bit of fun. Next historical episode, I should say, that'll be coming out in 2 weeks. That will be covering the March from Zion's Camp and the Zelf, the White Lamanite. So strap in. It's going to be a hell of a party. Get ready for next historical episode. So until then, I think we'll call that good for today's episode. Before finishing up, I need to thank a few people. I'll start off by thanking Noah and Lucinda Lugeons from the Scathing Atheist, the Skeptic Rat, and the God Awful Movie podcasts. If you haven't checked them out by this time, you are absolutely missing out, and they come highly recommended from everybody that I've ever talked to. Check out, Heath Enright and Eli Bosnick are the other co-hosts on the shows, and they do such a fantastic job, and they really put together a good product. Also want to personally thank Noah and Lucinda Lugeons for coming and hanging out. It was a lot of fun hanging out with you guys and discussing Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, among other things, and it was just really nice to see your faces again and record an episode with you. If you'd like to have your voice featured at the intro of the podcast and have your podcaster group plugged, you can find a script on the website. Simply email an MP3 of you saying those clips to nakedmormonism@gmail.com, and it will be included in the show just like Noah and Lucinda Lugeons did. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the patrons who support the show. If you'd like to be as awesome as them, you can go to patreon.com/nakedmormonism to sign up to make a per episode donation. If you can't afford a couple of bucks, you can always help out the show a bunch by going on to iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcast app of choice and leave a 5-star review for the show. And it only costs a couple of minutes instead of a couple of bucks. Thank you for everybody that shares the show through Facebook, Twitter, and other social media. If you'd like to get in touch with me directly, simply email nakedmormonism@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer your questions on the next listener mail segment. Check out the show notes and a lot more information about the show on nakedmormonismpodcast.com. Thanks to Demonista for working on the Facebook page that stays rich and full of fresh content and exciting conversation. Thanks to Jason Camo for his amazing music that's used in this show with permission. If you'd like to hear more of his music, all streaming available online, go to aloststateofmind.com. From me, Bryce Blankenagel, I would like to especially thank you, the listener, for lending me your ear. I hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.
I think, in honor of Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, we should.
Good old Dr. Philastus.
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't that such an epic name, dude?
That's the greatest name.
I bet that's Dr. Phil's real name. Which is
Yeah, right. No, I was like, yeah, right. That's how you got the doctor there and everything. No, when you said it, I was like, because at first when you're just kind of doing the summary, I'm like, oh my god, he just went over like the name Dr. Philastus Hurlbut like it was a normal name, and we didn't spend any time on that at all. And when I realized that the whole episode was going to be about him, I was like, oh my god, that's so awesome.
The biggest anti-Mormon ever.
This guy's got the word phallus and butt in his name. And it's funny for having phallus and butt in the name. Like it's like your name could be Phallus Butt, and it wouldn't be as funny.
And who names their kid fucking
Doctor? Right?
Doctor.
Yeah. What a load of shit.
What?
You ever read?
Insane.
You ever read Catch 22?
No, I have not.
Major. His dad named him. His last name was Major, but his dad named him Majors because his dad wanted him to go into the army and become a major, and he figured that if his name was Major, everybody would assume that he was a major, and eventually he'd get promoted to major, and then he did. So his name was Major, but he was also a major, so he was Major. Wait, is that right? I think I put one too many majors.
One too many.
Yeah.
4 of them.
I think yeah. Should be 4 altogether.
It's amazing.
Phenomenal book.
Prepared for our toast
to Dr. Hurlbut.
To Dr. Hurlbut.